We are back on Fresh Outlook for those who were in Dealey Plaza the day John F. Kennedy was killed. The memories are especially fresh. None more than the Secret Service agent who was closest to the slain president.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
I'm driving down the most painful of memory lanes with former Secret Service agent Clint Hill.
I saw the president move violently to his left, and I knew something was wrong. He grabbed at his throat.
A lone gunman fires 3 shots in 6 seconds and mortally wounds the most dashing president the United States has ever known. Clint Hill is the bodyguard climbing onto the back of the Kennedy limousine. 50 years on, he still hasn't forgiven himself for not saving the president's life. The funeral of JFK was held on the 25th of November, 1963. It was the 3rd birthday of his young son, John, who touchingly saluted the father he would never know.
Generals to privates all had a tear in their eye.
For the gunman Lee Harvey Oswald, no one would learn why he shot the president.
This is it's called the sniper's perch. This is where Lee Harvey Oswald secluded himself or put himself in a position to observe what was going on in the motorcade.
It took Clint Hill a long time to come to terms with the events of that day. Despite being awarded for his bravery, he battled depression and alcoholism for years after retiring from the service.
I'll have that sense that I should have been able to do just enough to get there in time, but you can't go faster than the speeding bullet.
And you can't turn back time.
No, you cannot.
It is said the death of President Kennedy spelled the end of America's age of innocence. Perhaps that's too simple and romantic a view, but it is a reflection of the mark one man and his beautiful wife left on the world, and left in particular on a long-retired but ever-loyal Secret Service agent.
Joined in this segment again by Republican strategist D.D. Benke, Dr. Janek Michkowski, chair of the History Department at Dowling College, and also joining us now is Donald Mazzella of NBC News, who covered the assassination and the investigation that followed that day. Welcome, all of you again.
Thank you.
Let's talk about your view on the age of innocence that maybe we lost upon that assassination. We've had the other folks here talk about it, but did you think it changed that day?
Well, I like to call it the age of confidence. I think the period post-war America, we could do anything. You mentioned earlier about Kennedy saying putting a man on the moon. The only question we had, did he mean 1969 or 1970? Mm-hmm. That was the only question put in front. And yes, we did lose something with him, with his assassination. We lost the idea that we were invulnerable, that and our institutions were also invulnerable. If you look at that period, at that particular event, and look over the next 50 years, all of our institutions have that we thought at the time were solid, were serving the people, etc., have all been brought into question. And I firmly believe that it was a watershed event, and one that sadly has led to a whole series of other ones.
Well, you make a great point. Here we are 50 years later. Nothing can get done in Washington. The polarization is so pronounced. We saw it this week with the Democrats saying the filibuster doesn't apply to presidential appointees anymore, something that would be unheard of even a few years ago. Here we are 50 years later, and the well is more poison than it ever has been. Can we directly tie that back to that? Is that when it began? Now, you say correct, Don. I find that hard to believe that it started there, but you say yes.
Oh, there's no question. If you follow events from that moment on, let me point out that Lyndon Johnson put forth a Great Society and all those other acts with the bipartisan support of a man that we seldom talk about, Everett Dirksen, the senator from Illinois. It was his support that made the difference. That was bipartisan. And if you look at events, from that point on, from the Great Society on, we've very seldom had bipartisan efforts in our governmental efforts. And why? Because we believe in conspiracy, we believe in selfishness. We impugn to our politicians things that before that we didn't.
Okay, let me hold you there. Professor Michalski, do you agree?
Well, Kennedy did manage to capture and represent a fusion of this idealism and activism and
But I mean,
and
did it lead
realism.
to where we are now is we can't get anything done?
Well,
Gridlock.
I think that's evolved because of the loss of moderation and communication between the White House and Congress, and that's been something we've seen more pronounced in the past quarter century or so. I think it's hard to pin it back directly to Kennedy, although I think America did lose a lot of its innocence and confidence at that time period. But there had been a loss of trust in government, starting even with Eisenhower and the U-2 incident, and that accelerated because of Vietnam and Watergate after it. So, and you can't tie those two events directly to Kennedy.
Dee Dee, there's a great book out, just came out. It's called The Gipper and Tip. It's about how President Reagan worked with Congressman Tip O'Neill.
He's your favorite, right?
And there's
Reagan, your favorite president.
Yes, there's a great, and I don't have any favorites. There's a great photograph on the cover of Tip O'Neill with his arm around Reagan. Now, could you imagine John Boehner with his arm around Obama?
No, no, it's a different time now, and I do think that it was a watershed moment, at least to some degree, because the media changed too. Remember how the media protected President Reagan? We didn't hear anything that he did.
You mean President Kennedy?
Oh, sorry, yes, President Kennedy.
Yes.
I've got Reagan on the brain. But President Kennedy, because, all presidents are flawed. They have issues in their private life. Never heard about it, not with Kennedy. And then when the murder happened, the assassination happened, you're thinking, my goodness. And then I think the press completely changed. And they would come out with, is there a conspiracy? Is it the CIA? Is it Johnson? What is it? What's the corruption? How could this happen?
Then we had Watergate.
Exactly. So I think that it actually did change with the press, and it changed with our attitudes in America. To some degree, of course.
Why can't we get back to that point where, and I remember in the book, I believe, Tip O'Neill said, yes, we argue between 9 to 5, but after 5, we have a few drinks and why can't we disagree without being disagreeable?
Reagan and Tip O'Neill are very different people than Boehner and Obama. They're just different personalities, and it has risen to more of a fever pitch, but I think a lot of that is social media, and the media, they're trying to just fill all time. So they're looking for anything and everything, and which is controversial and will just cause news, and I think it's unfortunate in a way.
Conflict is news in part.
Yeah.
Well, the essence of news is conflict.
Yes.
But in a 24/7 news cycle as we're into today, we can't afford people go and rush to get whatever they have out there without verification, etc. I point out one thing. At NBC, we knew the president was dead as soon as Dan Rather did. But we did not go with the news until we got the official announcement.
I think there was a 17-minute gap where you knew for 17 minutes. Let's move on to the conspiracy theories. I've seen this, I've analyzed it, I've read about it, and up until 10 years ago I thought maybe there was a conspiracy. But we didn't have the scientific abilities that we did then now. I mean, we can make a 3D model, a high-definition model, and it seems to me that there really is no argument anymore. It came from one place and it came from behind it, but why do we still have this after all these years?
I just think it seems so remarkable and unbelievable that this could happen. People still don't want to accept it.
You agree, Professor?
Yeah, I think there's a moral imbalance of this young loser shooting the leader of the free world, and people look to find some greater meaning to the assassination, and so they like to impute these conspiracy theories, even though, as you say, it's been one of the most thoroughly investigated murders in history. Earl Warren himself said that if he were a district attorney and tried this case, he'd have enough evidence to get a jury conviction in 2 days, and
but there is a large
again.
percentage of Americans, Donald, as well, who still think that there is a conspiracy, that they're convinced there is a conspiracy, even everything we know right now.
Well, two things. A lot of people have made a lot of money off of the conspiracy theory, and whenever there's money to be had, there'll be people that will do it. That's number one. And number two, I see a generational issue here as well. The younger people that I've talked to who find out that I was involved in this in one way or the other, they're absolutely convinced it's a conspiracy theory. Nothing you can, they cannot think of someone being a loner, acting as he did, and why would he do it? Well, let's face it, Oswald had his reasons. And the people forget three things I always point out. One, no one's ever put any two people in the room together. Two, Oswald thought he would get away with it. And would you trust Ruby with a secret? I mean, he was, according to one of the women he worked for, he was a nebbish. So,
well, you may have to explain that term, because that's a Yiddish term.
A Yiddish term for a jerk, a guy who couldn't keep his mouth shut.
He was a nerd. He was a nerdy kind of guy.
I don't want to raise a nerd to that level, or lower that.
All right, we
level.
just have a few minutes left. Let's talk about his legacy. We're talking about JFK's legacy. What did he leave us? Professor, we'll start with you.
Hope and idealism and inspiration for a younger generation, and also a model for future presidents to look to. For example, accepting responsibility after the Bay of Pigs, after which he saw his highest public approval ratings, his rhetoric and eloquence. These are all very inspirational for Americans to look to.
We haven't had many presidents who've said, you know, I messed up after JFK. There have been a few, obviously, but it's always, you know, if I hurt somebody, I'm sorry. It's never really an apology somewhere around it. What is his legacy, Dee Dee?
You know what? I couldn't have said it better. I mean, that's exactly right, because he was so inspirational. We're still inspired by President Kennedy's words today, and we're still mesmerized by the family, and we still want to have a presidency like that. And I'm a Republican, but I'm a big fan of Kennedy and what he tried to do for our country with symbolism and hope. I really, really like this president.
Donald, we have just a few seconds. His legacy.
The space program. No ands, ifs, or buts about it. He started it, Johnson continued it, and we've got great triumphs from it. That to me.
Donald Mazzella, thank you so much for joining us. Also, Professor, we appreciate your time today and your insight. Dee Dee, you're sticking around, I think. All right, when we return, what has become of our elected officials, and has the bar been lowered so low, it's at the point of no return. We'll be right back.